right, so we're live and on in color. I'm coming to you from the second floor situation room.
And I'm coming to you from the underground garage.
So Mr. Zagari and I thought we'd kind of walk you through a little bit of a DBQ how-to. We did this in class, oh boy, probably end of September, early October is when we did our American Revolution DBQ. If you go back to Google Classroom and you look at those dates, I want to say end of September, beginning of October, Zags, maybe like October 1st. That sound right?
That sounds about right. Yep.
Yeah, so look at those dates and you'll see the postings that we did at that time, and you can go back into Google Classroom and find the original DBQ that we wrote, which was on the American Revolution. So we thought today we'd give you kind of the dummy's guide to doing DBQs. Of course, I guess we're the dummies in this one, not you guys, because you take this class, you must be super bright. So, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that College Board loves this DBQ. It really is, to them, the perfect exemplar of what good historical work is. It's the reason why last year when they did a full remote test, the entire test was a DBQ, because they love all the historical skills it requires. They love all the processing of documents, obviously the writing component. But let's be honest here, it's a difficult task. It's pushing the boulder up the hill. And remember, it's the only assessment we do that you can't complete in a class period. So they really believe this is their, you know, kind of the flagship. This is the assessment that more than anything else really judges your ability to process information. That also means that they realize that it's not going to be perfect. Don't forget, you know, as Mr. Zags and I have talked about on a bunch of occasions, you're writing the first draft, and that's what you get to hand in. So they're grading accordingly. So what our goal is for writing these DBQs is to get you comfortable with the things that you can nail right away. And as the year progresses, we're going to work on the things that usually trip people up a little bit more. Things like context, the reasoning point, which is really the unicorn, and even for some people, that outside evidence point, which I think, you Zags, you can probably agree, it's not so much that you don't know the information, it's just that when you're so busy writing everything else, you sometimes forget to provide that additional information.
Yep, it's all part of the theory that we have of like the drive-by. We're just, you know, you're just going through it so quickly, you're not getting into the depths of the analysis of it.
Right, but again, that's what separates the really good historian from somebody who's learning to be the historian. Okay, so let's move on to the presentation here. So on our next slide, you should see this is the same page that we shared with you early in the year. This is the overall rubric, and it just breaks down for you what each portion of the rubric gives you points for. Your opening paragraph is going to include your contextualization and your thesis, followed by your body paragraphs. I'm a big proponent that you should never have a number burned into your head because you don't know what the essay is going to ask you to do. Sometimes 4 body paragraphs might make the most sense. Other times it might be 2. It might be 3. It might depend on the categories that you have. If they give you categories in the question like political, economic, and social, there's probably 3 paragraphs. If they ask you for positives and negatives, that maybe is the 2 paragraphs. You know, I've had students in the past who write a separate body paragraph for each document. I don't always love that, because I think then you end up not really connecting those documents together, and that's something the College Board likes to see as well. So in those body paragraphs, this is where you're going to use your documents, specifically providing the historical information that the documents provide to you. It's where you're going to do sourcing for at least 3 of those documents. And remember, that's when you talk about the author's point of view, or the historical purpose of the document, or what's the other factor I'm forgetting there, Zags?
Audience.
Audience, thank you. So who's the intended audience of the document? It's also in those body paragraphs that you're going to try and include that one significant piece of outside evidence. And then lastly, as we'll talk about when we get to the end, you got to try and look for that reasoning point. It's a lot harder to get. It really requires that all the rest of the essay is done well, and then you give them the cherry on top. So we're going to go through these in more specific detail. So let's move on to our next slide. Okay, so we just came up with this as a prompt. It's actually perfectly suited for the topics we're doing right now. And hopefully by the time you see this presentation, we'll have started our discussion on the Plantation South. So here's the prompt. Here's the question. Explain how slavery continued to expand from the 1790s through the 1840s, and how supporters and detractors of slavery responded to that expansion. Okay, we got a couple of things going on here. So it's always a good idea to dissect that question first. So let's head to the next slide just so you can see a little bit of annotation. All right, so obviously the first part of the question, how slavery continued to expand in this time period. All right, now right away that tells you that some of the documents are going to deal with slavery's expansion, and they're going to cover, they're going to be contained within that period of the 1790s to the 1840s. Now this one's a little bit tricky because there's actually a second part to this question. So you have to handle two things: how the supporters and detractors of slavery responded to the expansion. So maybe they're going to give you a document that has to do with the annexation of Texas, for example, right? And we haven't actually done that one yet. That'll be in the Manifest Destiny chapter. But in a document DBQ like this, if it came to you in May, you would have already covered it. So you're going to have a document that talks about expansion, or two or three, and then you're going to have documents that give you the support or the detracting of slavery. So a lot of things, a lot of balls in the air here that you kind of have to juggle going through this. Okay? All right, why don't we go to our next slide? Zags, you can pick it up.
Okay, so now once you have read the question and you have dissected the question, and like Mr. O'Hagan was just saying, you see all the moving parts in the question, it's time to get started with our introductory paragraph. Okay, so you're going to get a possibility of 2 points for the introductory paragraph. And what you're going to see, you see here with our upside down pyramid, is that we want to start broad and then narrow it down. And the broader scope of history, what we have to think about is a camera lens. Okay, when you zoom out on something and you want to take a picture of something and you zoom out, you're going to get more of the background in there. You're going to get, you know, a much more wider perspective through that lens. And then as you zoom in towards your perspective, that's as you're targeting in on what the overarching goal of your photography is going to be. And it's very similar to what we're trying to do with our introductory paragraph. So we want to introduce the broader themes that influence the time period and the topic of the prompt. So you want to bring the reader up at least 30, but you can go all the way up to 50, 75 years prior to that. So what you're looking at here, if our prompt is saying starting in the 1790s, you want to go at least to the 1760s, maybe even before that, so you're really connecting that with the colonial era. Okay, you wanted to, and it has to be relevant to the prompt. So right then and there, you have to talk about basically the introduction of slave labor into the American British colonies, and then you could even go in further at the founding of the Republic. Maybe you bring up something like the 3/5 Compromise, or a notion like that of how it was compromising very early on in the Republic, even during the creation of the Constitution. And you want to define any key terms if not commonly known. So if there's a term in there that's not commonly known, you want to make sure that you define it for the reader. Again, you want to make sure that you have to think that the reader is naive, that they do not know what you're talking about. Okay? So make sure those themes get more specific and relate to the prompt. So you want to narrow it down as you're writing your introductory paragraph. And then eventually you're going to get to the thesis statement where you give your thesis. It's your take. It's the prompt. It's the last sentence. Make sure it is the last sentence in your introductory paragraph. And the most important thing is with your thesis statement, it must be historically defensible. So you have to first go through your documents to kind of get a bearing on where you want your thesis to go. Okay. And like Mr. O'Hagan was saying before, is it going to be a positive or a negative? Is it going to be a political, social, economic? In this case, it's supporters. It's the start of slavery. What's adding to slavery? It's supporters of slavery. It's detractors of slavery as well. So that all has to be in your thesis, and it should be historically defensible. So the driving force behind your thesis statement is your documentation. Okay.
let me just pop in there a second, Zach. This question is actually from an older exam, and I think they've taken more effort to make sure that they don't usually give you these two-parters. The DBQ questions now are more direct than this one, but if you can manage to answer this style of question, then the more direct ones they're using now aren't going to give you any problems. So it's okay to practice with a question that's a little bit trickier, because it'll help you understand some of those nuances better. And then when you get something that's a little more straightforward on the test, you'll be flying high. You'll be very comfortable answering that kind of question. Okay.
Okay. So let's go over and look at an example of this. So again, our question: explain how slavery continued to expand from the 1790s through the 1840s, and how supporters and detractors of slavery responded to this expansion. So let's look at the context first. Remember the broader scope of history. From nearly the time of its founding, the U.S. had used slave labor to produce goods and services. In the colonial era, there was little serious public discussion about its future, but there was an agreed to view of slavery as a necessary evil. When the cotton gin was invented, so see, now we're transitioning. Now we're going from the early foundings of the Republic, and we're transitioning into the time period that's given by College Board, which is the 1790s. And we're going into starting to talk about the cotton gin, which is going to revolutionize farming and slavery. So when the cotton gin was invented in the early 1790s, the aging system of labor became invaluable to the economic growth of the South. Slavery supporters began to more stringently defend its continuation, while its detractors were more likely to view it as a disease that had to be contained. Sorry, my computer's like there.
Yeah, you're back.
Now we're transitioning into the thesis. So now our zoom lens is getting in tighter. All right, we started out broad. We started with the colonial America. All right, we started with the founding of the country. Then we narrowed it down. Now we're into the time period that was given to us, the early part of that. And now we're transitioning into our thesis statement.
This is your close-up.
What was that?
This is your close-up. You're
close.
You're bringing the lens in close now.
Yep. As the nation's territory grew and cotton growers became more motivated by soaring profits from the 1790s to the 1840s, we're given the broad scope here. Those opposing views clashed more frequently. Supporters began to claim states' rights and Christian responsibility for slaves, while opponents argued that slavery was a moral evil and backward system that was hurting whites as well as blacks. So what we're seeing here is that this thesis statement it's giving you both sides of it, okay? It's stating here, as the nation's territory grew and cotton growers became more motivated by soaring profits. So right then and there, we see the economic impact. That's adding to the growing issue over slavery is the economy, okay? And we know that during this time period, we have the market revolution. So there's better transportation systems, there's better technology, etc. Then we're going to transition into the second part of the question, the and part of the question. Okay, the supporters and the detractors. So we're specifically giving you here that supporters began to claim states' rights and Christian responsibilities. So now, being a defensible claim, that we have to then, in our body paragraphs, answer the states' rights and the Christian responsibilities from our documents. And then we also have to give the other side of it, the other perspective, the opponent's argument that slavery was a moral evil and a backward system that was hurting whites as well as blacks. So we have to have we have to have enough evidence to support that claim. So right then and there, we see the transition. Again, we started broad, and now we're getting it in tighter.
And let's not forget either, guys, this was written, the context and this part of it's all one paragraph. We just couldn't fit it on one slide.
Right.
But both the context and this were written by somebody who has seen those documents already. So this is all informed by what they know the documents already give them. You know, we're doing it kind of blind here because you don't have the documents in front of you. We gave you this as the model, but you have to assume that this is the kind of stuff you're writing after you've seen those documents, right? You don't just kind of pull this out of thin air. You're relying on the information that's available to you, made available through College Board, giving you the 7 documents that you've already annotated and read through and categorized. And that's what informed this writing, okay? Because I know somebody might be looking at this going, oh my God, I'm never going to come up with that on my own. You don't have to, guys. They give you the documents to do that. Okay.
Remember, driving force in a DBQ, it's a document-based question.
Correct.
So the documents are the fuel for your fire. That's what's driving this. That's what's going to determine your thesis statement. That's what's going to determine your evaluation, is what the documents are telling you. Go
with the flow. Use the documents and what they tell you, and that's what you're going to write your argument based on. You know, you can be a little brave, but you know, if you want to play it safe, then you just rely on the documents and what they've given you. You don't have to come up with something brand new. They're not looking for you to reinvent the wheel. Okay? All right, let's move to our next one. Okay, so we just talked about your context and your thesis. And now once that opening paragraph is done, then you've set up the rest of the essay. This is where your body paragraphs are going to come in. And remember, this is where all of these documents are going to be used. You don't want to just quote a document. You want to paraphrase it. I know I'm always a big stickler on this, and I'm sure Zags, you feel the same way.
Circle in there.
Yeah, do not write in document A it says, all right? Because when you do that, you're trapping yourself into just regurgitating the document. You're not processing it. You're not analyzing it. So always paraphrase. And I've told my students, pretend like it was your idea. You know, you can pretend like you just came up with this idea yourself, and then at the end, in parentheses,
you're citing it anyway.
Doc A. And you don't, College Board has told us that you don't even need to write Doc A in parentheses, because they know what the documents say. They know what you're referencing. I've always thought it's a good idea for you as the writer, because then you can kind of go back through your essay and it gives you a visual flag where you can do a, you know, can say, oh my God, how many documents did I use? Boom, I counted up the 6 that I referenced. The other thing I'll just make quick mention of here, there are times where you're going to have 2 documents that express very similar ideas. So write one sentence, and at the end of that sentence, write Doc A, comma, Doc D. If it applies to 2 documents, join them together. College Board likes to see
that. Love it. That's only going to help you with your reasoning point.
And it shows that you understand the relationship between the documents. They don't just throw these documents in here at random, all right? They believe there's an interconnectedness between these documents. So try to do that. And then, of course, you have to do that for 6 documents, and then finally you're going to have to remind the reader of either the author's point of view or their purpose or their intended audience for 3 of those documents. So that's an additional analytical component that you have to think of. So mention 6 and express what's in those documents, put it in your own words, but then give us the deeper analytical understanding by highlighting the author's point of view, purpose, or intended audience, right? And Mr. Zags is going to give you an example right now of a document that could be found in a DBQ like this and how we process it.
Right, and I also want to say one thing on this slide is that when you're going through the document, so that 10 or 15 minutes before you even begin writing, that I always say to categorize the documents, okay? What's the larger, is there a theme going on? Is it a social? Is it political? Is it an economic? Or in the case of our question, is it talking about the expansion of slavery? Is it supporting slavery, or is it a detractor of slavery? This way you have it so that then you could go like back what Mr. O'Hagan said, excuse me, and connect those documents, okay? Find the inner fabrics between the documents, and that'll help you with your little nuances. And just as Mr. O'Hagan just said, just knowing, proving to College Board that you have a great grasp on the question, on the content, and everything that's leading up to it. Okay, so we're going to move on here to our first document. We're only going to go through one document, and this source, we always want to look at the source first, okay? This is from James McPherson, Ordeal by Fire, New York, McGraw-Hill, okay? This is actually a secondary source, so that'll help as well that it's a secondary source. So let's read this together. Economic historians have demonstrated that slavery was profitable, but profitable for whom? Another way to look at the economics of slavery is to ask whether the institution promoted or inhibited Southern development. Slavery formed the foundation of the South's distinctive social order. Break down slavery, said Governor Wise of Virginia, and you would with the same blow destroy the democratic principle of equality among men. Here was the central paradox of American history. Slavery became for many whites the foundation of liberty and equality. For the slaves, there was no paradox. Slavery was slavery, and freedom was the opposite. Chattel bondage gave the master great power over his slaves to buy or sell, to punish without sanction of the courts, to separate families, to exploit sexually, even to kill with little fear of being held legally responsible. As a form of property, the slaves had few human rights in the eyes of the law. Okay, so now let's break down this document. We're going to move to the next slide. So we're going to do details that support your thesis and then the sourcing of the document. So if we look back on our thesis statement, I'm going to scroll back here to our thesis statement. As the nation's territories grew and cotton growers became more motivated by soaring profits from the 1790s to the 1840s, those opposing views clashed more frequently. Supporters began to claim states' rights and Christian responsibility for slaves, while opponents argued that slavery was a moral evil and a backward system that was hurting whites as well as blacks. So what we're looking at with this document is that this document actually breaks the two. Okay, this document can be used as both a supporter argument and a detractor argument. Okay, so when we look at the document again, all right, we see right here when we see break down slavery, said Governor Wise of Virginia, and you would with the same blow destroy the democratic principle of equality among men. Okay, even if you go before that, slavery formed the foundation of the South's distinctive social order. This is the states' rights argument right here. This is the breakdown of supporting states' rights and where the Southerners felt that they have the right to choose for themselves if they want slavery or not, that it's not the government, especially the federal government's responsibility to articulate that to the Southern states. So they feel that their freedom, remember, they're coming off of that revolutionary ideology of what is freedom. It's really political freedom. Okay, the reform movements have been, a force field away from them. And it hasn't been infiltrating the Southern social pyramid. So their ideology of freedom is that it's freedom. It's freedom against an oppressive government. Okay, and by a government dictating whether or not they can own a slave or not, well, that they're saying is it's their freedom. It's their choice to decide. Okay, whereas the other side of it, when you're looking at the opposition, right here, we're saying that slavery became for many whites the foundation of liberty and equality. Excuse me. For the slaves, there was no paradox. Slavery was slavery, and freedom was its opposite. Bondage gave the masters great power over his slaves to buy or sell, to punish without sanctions of the courts, etc., etc. This right here is going into the morality of slavery. Right. That these are human beings, that you're separating families, that you're exploiting sexually, that you could kill without being held legally responsible for murder. So right then and there, it's the moral evil of slavery. So this document can be used for both. It could be used both for the supporting evidence of supporting the institution, but it can also be used as the detracting evidence of the moral issues that were taking away the freedoms of human beings. Because to this point of view right here, all right, this second point of view is that freedom, this is not free. Freedom is freedom. Freedom is not being, sexually abused or killed or separated from your family. Like, that's not freedom. This, on the other hand, it's their argument of more of a political freedom, that they have, that the government is not dictating what they can and cannot do to their own, of what they consider their own property. Okay. All right. So anything else you want to add to that, Mr. O'Hagan, about the document usage?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. So we'll continue on.
We'll move on to outside evidence.
Outside evidence. So
now, the thing to keep in mind with outside evidence, guys, and we're running here. Yeah, we're about 22, 23 minutes in. So we're gonna wrap this up a little more quickly. So outside evidence is something that you bring in, as the name suggests, from outside the documents, but it's got to be relevant to the subject of the documents and especially to the question. Guys, this DBQ is about slavery, so think about anything else that's going on from 1790 to 1840. All right, you don't have the other documents, so it's hard to judge what's already in them. But if this is a DBQ about slavery, and this is a topic that ranges from 1790 to 1840, right away in my head, I'm thinking to myself, okay, I probably have the whole market revolution that I could pull from. This is the age of the reformers. I don't know if abolitionists come up in any of the other documents that are in here, but if they don't, man, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, like those are great names to be able to bring in and then connect it to the question. For example, William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, was one of the strongest proponents of slavery as a moral evil. He felt without question that until slavery was ended, that America could never fulfill its promise of being this land of greatness. Boom, 2 sentences. You just gave outside evidence. You almost have to think in terms of creating an additional document. You've got 7 documents. If you were going to add an 8th document, what would you add in? And if you can kind of make that pretend, you can pretend that in your mind, then that's what you're going to use for your outside evidence. That's obviously a lot easier to do when you see the 7 documents they give you. But one of the things I always suggest is, as you're going through and you're annotating your documents, jot down some notes. Jot down, play word association. I see this document and it makes me think of this. And I guarantee if you did that for each document, you're eventually going to come up with something that's not contained anywhere else. All right. But again, the real key here is whatever evidence you provide, it must be relevant to the question. All right. I always use it. It's a dumb example, but I think it drives the point home. Yeah. If you're doing a DBQ on the Civil War, you can't write that Abraham Lincoln was tall and wore a black hat unless Lincoln's being tall and wearing a black hat is directly related to the question, which who knows, is maybe something about did the height of political leadership impact the outcome of the Civil War? It's not going to be that. That'd be a wild question. But the point is, this is hard to do when you've juggled all that other work. So sometimes you forget that this has to get done. See if you can figure out how to make it almost like a game. What's the additional document I would add if I had the opportunity? Okay? All right.
Okay. So we're going to finish this up with the reasoning point. Okay. That's the last point of the rubric. And now what we're looking at here with the reasoning point, it's the unicorn point. Okay. 3% of the APUSH taking population gets the reasoning point. But just because you don't get the reasoning point doesn't mean you can't get a 5 on the exam. Okay. But it's a holistic point. Every other point in the rubric we can find in your paper and give you the point for or not give you the point for. The reasoning point is holistic. It's not just found in one place. And it's not just simply organization of your paper, although that does play a part in it. It's the overall essay displays a complex understanding. It has different layers. It shows connections between the documents. Okay, there's a fabric that's going through the essay. Okay, you also, another way, that little icing on the cake is to connect it to a different time period. And we always say that we like to tell the students to make sure if you're connecting it to a different time period, you have a separate paragraph, because you're more likely to go into depth in a separate paragraph than trying just to do a drive-by in a body paragraph that's connecting with a document. So take it to a different time period. Use the historical themes, okay? American identity, work exchange and technology, America in the world, et cetera, okay? Prove to the reader that you have a grasp on connecting this whole thing together. We watched today in class the rise of capitalism, and Donald Miller, Professor Miller from Lafayette, talked about Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century, about immigration and about reforms and about growing the American economy. And then he said this wouldn't have happened unless you had the market revolution coming about in the 1830s and the 1840s. So he was connecting that theme of America, American identity, work exchange and technology, politics and power, all together there, and connecting it to both time periods. Okay, so again, this is a layering point. There's no clear cut yes or no, there it is or there it is not. And just because even if you have a a paragraph from a different time period, it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to get it. Again, like Mr. O'Hagan said with the outside information, it has to be relevant to the prompt.
Right.
Right. Anything you want to add to the reasoning point, Mr. O?
No, I think that's it. Just to keep in mind that, you know, it's hard to just write one thing and count it as the reasoning point. The reader is really looking for the totality of your essay, that connection, that theme that seems to be woven through the whole thing. That's what they're looking for. Okay. All right. I think we're at our last slide, which appropriately enough, you should always try and write a conclusion. It helps with your overall organization. It's kind of a chance to nail down the reasoning point because, you know, you've connected everything together. A good conclusion always kind of restates the question and reminds the reader of the important arguments. I'll say this very clearly. If you don't write a conclusion, you can still get full credit on your essay. But, you know, as I've always said, we're not just trying to get you to, you know, be like rubric monsters. We want you to be better writers, and including a conclusion is something that makes you a better writer. The ability to do these things, to restate your question, to restate your thesis, to bring it all back together, that's an important skill to have. So if the time is available, you write a conclusion. And I think that's our last slide. Am I right? Or we have one more? Oh, a couple of things to keep in mind.
Keep in mind.
Stay true to that time period. You know, if they're telling you 1790 to 1840, that's what you want to write about in the heart of your essay. You want to go out of the time period for your context and potentially out of the time period to get some reasoning point. But otherwise, you've got to make sure you emphasize. And don't forget, all the documents are geared for the time period as well. You want to try and use all the documents. Standard number is 7. That's how many they're going to give you. As long as you do 6, you're good to go. You can get full rubric points for that. So if there's one you just don't get, maybe the document we just showed you here, the McPherson document, you said, oh man, I don't know if I could figure that one out. Okay, so maybe that's what you leave off the table. Maybe it's a political cartoon and you're like, I don't know what that's supposed to tell me.
You don't want to force it.
Don't force it. Leave it. You know, you're better off. But you got to do at least 6. And then just some writing points. Don't write in document A, it says. It's just bad writing. Do you want to cite the documents? You absolutely do. It's for your benefit. The reader knows what the documents are, but it helps you out. And then on this PowerPoint, there's a link. I don't know. Can these guys, they won't be able to get the link.
I don't think they'll be able to get the link, but I could put the link in the description.
Okay, so the link for our score sheet is right there. It's basically the score sheet we use. It's based exactly off the rubric. Okay, so we think, you know, if you have any questions, it's a good idea to go back and look at this presentation again. You can always, you know, go to your favorite parts. But if you look at the rubric or the score sheet itself, I think it gives you some very straightforward explanations as to what you need to do for each section. And guys, the other thing about this is you're not going to come out of the gate writing the perfect DBQ. This is something that's going to develop over the year. So use this as a stepping stone.
Especially that connecting it to a different time period. Remember, it's only November. We still have a lot of history to go through yet.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. All right. Well, I think we're going to call the time out here because I think we covered what we needed to cover, and we appreciate you watching. If you do have questions, of course, you got to ask them before Monday because Monday is when our DBQ is going to start. Okay.
So.
All right.
All right, everyone. Strive for the 5.
See you from the second floor situation room sometime soon.
We'll catch you later from the underground garage.
And this is going to be posted on Mr. Zagari's YouTube channel, okay?
That's where it's at. 100 subscribers.
That's how you're seeing it, I assume. That's how you figured out that's where it is.
All right. We'll catch you guys later.
Take it easy.